Eleanor had always felt a special connection to the forest. Living alone in a small, cozy cabin at the edge of a vast woodland, she spent most of her days tending to the plants in her garden and the occasional injured animal that wandered into her care. She had no family left, but she never felt lonely. The forest, with its towering trees and whispering winds, was her companion. She had spent her youth traveling the world, but as the years passed, it was clear that this peaceful, quiet life was where she truly belonged. One crisp spring morning, as Eleanor ventured out to gather firewood, she heard an unusual sound, a faint, desperate cry coming from the direction of the thicket near the edge of the forest. It was a soft, pitiful noise, and at first she thought it might be some small animal in distress. But as she followed the sound, her heart quickened with concern. The cry wasn't like anything she had heard before, and it seemed to grow louder as she got closer. Pushing through the underbrush, she finally stumbled upon the source of the sound. There, lying in a small, hollowed-out area beneath a group of thick ferns, were 4 tiny bobcat cubs. They were no more than a few weeks old, their eyes barely open, their fur thin and matted with dirt. They were weak and trembling, shivering from the cold. Their mother, who should have been nearby, was nowhere to be seen. Eleanor's heart sank. The cubs were abandoned, and without their mother they stood no chance of survival in the wild. She knew she couldn't just leave them there to die. The forest had always been kind to her, offering up its gifts of herbs and food, and in return she had taken care of it, nurturing the animals that came to her door. Now it was time for her to give back, to save these helpless creatures that had no one else. Eleanor carefully scooped up each cub, cradling them gently in her arms. Their small bodies were so fragile, and their cries echoed in her ears as she rushed back to her cabin. She hurried inside, making sure to close the door behind her to keep out the cold. The room, filled with the warmth of a crackling fire, offered the perfect shelter for the tiny cubs. She set them down in a soft old blanket by the hearth, where they could begin to warm up. As the fire crackled, Eleanor quickly set to work. She cleaned the cubs as best as she could, gently washing away the dirt and grime from their fur. Her hands moved with the practiced care of someone who had spent a lifetime tending to animals in need. She knew the cubs would need more than just warmth. They needed food, something to sustain them and help them regain their strength. But what could she offer them? She had no milk from other animals, no formula for wild creatures like these. Eleanor thought for a moment, then remembered an old trick she had once heard of. She had a few goats in a small pen near the cabin. Maybe their milk would be enough. She hurried outside, returned with a small amount of milk, and carefully began feeding the cubs, one by one. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The cubs drank eagerly, their tiny paws reaching up to her as they suckled. Their fragile bodies were slowly beginning to show signs of improvement. It was clear that they were fighters, and with each passing day, Eleanor grew more and more determined to ensure they survived. She didn't know what had happened to their mother, but she couldn't dwell on that now. The cubs needed her, and she would do everything in her power to give them a chance at life. As the days turned into weeks, Eleanor found herself growing attached to the cubs. They had a wildness in their eyes, a spark of independence that made her smile. But they also trusted her, and slowly they began to grow stronger. The once tiny, frail creatures began to show their true nature: sharp claws, keen senses, and an innate ability to move with the grace and stealth of their kind. Eleanor was amazed at how quickly they adapted, learning to explore their surroundings and even practicing their hunting instincts. She would watch them with pride, knowing that she had given them the best chance possible to survive in the wild. Despite their increasing independence, however, the cubs always returned to her cabin at the end of the day, seeking the warmth of the fire and the comfort of her presence. The bond between them was undeniable, and Eleanor couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. She had saved their lives, and in return, they had given her the joy of watching them grow into magnificent creatures. As the seasons changed, the cubs grew stronger and more independent, each day revealing new aspects of their developing personalities. The once tiny, fragile creatures that had huddled for warmth in Eleanor's cabin were now sleek, agile bobcats, their fur thickening into the dappled patterns of their wild kind. Eleanor could see the shift in them, a subtle but unmistakable pull towards the wilderness that had once been their home. She had raised them with the intention of giving them the skills they would need to survive. But as they reached maturity, she began to understand that they were becoming creatures of the wild again, not pets or tame animals. It was clear that the time had come for them to learn the ways of the forest on their own, and yet, despite the growing distance between them and the cabin, the bond between them and Eleanor remained strong. Every day she would watch them as they ventured further into the woods, exploring their surroundings with a natural curiosity that amazed her. Their sharp senses guided them as they navigated the underbrush, practiced their stealth, and tested their strength. Eleanor had no doubt that they would thrive in the forest, but the thought of them leaving still tugged at her heart. Though they began to hunt on their own, the cubs continued to return to Eleanor's cabin each evening. She could hear the soft rustle of leaves or the gentle patting of their paws outside her door, and when she opened it, there they were, 4 bobcats, sleek and graceful, with wild eyes that gleamed in the fading light of dusk. They would nudge their way inside, their warm bodies pressing close to hers as they sat by the fire, the same cubs she had once nursed back to health, now sitting like sentinels around her. Over time, the cubs began to bring their kills with them. At first, Eleanor hesitated, unsure of how to accept their offerings, but she quickly realized that they were bringing her gifts. The animals they caught, small deer, rabbits, and other creatures, were left by her door, laid carefully with the precision and patience they had learned in the wild. The cubs didn't ask for anything in return, but Eleanor understood what it meant. It was their way of showing gratitude, a silent acknowledgement of the care she had given them when they were helpless and alone. In the mornings, she would often find the remnants of their hunts outside her cabin, and though she knew they had learned the art of survival, part of her still felt a pang of sadness. The bobcats were growing more self-sufficient, more wild, and she could feel the inevitable pull of nature pulling them away. It wasn't that they no longer needed her. It was that they had become everything she had hoped they would be: strong, capable, and free. Yet, in their newfound independence, they still sought her out. The bond they had shared during their early days, when they had been so small and vulnerable, had not been broken. They trusted her, even if they no longer needed her in the same way. Eleanor had always understood that the wild was a force greater than any one individual, but she could not deny that a part of her longed for things to remain as they were. The cubs had been her responsibility, her joy, and now they were becoming creatures of the wild once more. One morning after a particularly chilly night, Eleanor noticed something new. The cubs seemed different somehow. They had become more than just creatures who had learned to survive. They had started to embody the untamed spirit of the forest. They moved with a confidence that was unmistakable, and when they left that day, Eleanor didn't know if they would return. She watched them as they disappeared into the trees, their figures fading into the shadows of the forest. For the first time, she wondered if they had truly outgrown the cabin and would never come back. It was a bittersweet realization. She had prepared them for this moment, but she wasn't sure she was ready to let go. Yet, as the days passed, the cubs did return. They didn't stay for long, but they came. The bond between them had not disappeared. It had simply evolved. They were not her cubs anymore, but they still respected her, still remembered the care she had given them when they were small. The days turned into weeks, and as the warmth of summer began to fade into the cool bite of fall, Eleanor found herself standing at the edge of her cabin one evening, peering into the dimming light of the forest. The cubs had been absent for days now, and though she didn't want to admit it, a deep sense of worry had started to take root in her heart. They had always come back, even when they had grown older and more independent. They had always returned to her, their familiar, graceful forms appearing at the threshold, seeking the comfort of her presence and the warmth of the fire. But this time, the days passed without a single visit. At first, Eleanor told herself that the cubs were simply busy, exploring the deeper parts of the forest, perhaps hunting in places they had not yet ventured. She assured herself that they were fine, that they had simply grown more self-sufficient and no longer needed to check in as often. But as time went on, that initial optimism started to fade, replaced by an unsettling feeling of emptiness. She missed the sound of their paws on the ground, the quiet rustling of the trees as they brushed past her window, and the way they would sit by the fire, their eyes reflecting the dancing flames. Her heart ached with the absence of their presence, and though she knew the forest had a way of pulling creatures into its depths, she couldn't help but feel a sense of loss. What if something had happened to them? What if they had encountered danger out there in the wilderness, far from the safety of her cabin? The thought was enough to send a chill down her spine. Eleanor decided to take matters into her own hands. She couldn't just sit in her cabin, waiting for the cubs to return. She would find them. She gathered a small pack, with some provisions, tied on her boots, and set off toward the forest, her steps quickening with each passing minute. She knew the forest like the back of her hand, and although she had never ventured too far from her cabin, she was certain that if the cubs were still out there, she would find them. Days passed as she scoured the woods. She followed trails, looked for signs of paw prints, and listened intently for the familiar calls of the bobcats. Each night, she returned to her cabin, weary but determined. The forest was vast, and despite her search, she could find no trace of them. The cubs, once so close and familiar, had disappeared without a single sign. It wasn't until the third week of her search that she found something that gave her hope. While walking along a narrow, overgrown trail in a part of the forest she had never explored, Eleanor noticed something unusual. 4 large, fresh paw prints, larger than any she had ever seen before. They were deep in the soft earth, indicating a creature that was no longer small and helpless. Eleanor's heart leapt in her chest. These were the tracks of the cubs, no longer the tiny paw prints of the babies she had cared for, but the powerful steps of adult bobcats. She bent down to inspect them more closely, her breath catching in her throat. It was clear that the cubs had not only survived, they had grown into strong, capable predators. They had found their place in the wild, as she had always hoped they would. But where had they gone? Were they far from here, living in the deeper parts of the forest? Was it possible that they were starting their own family, continuing the cycle of life in a place that was both wild and familiar? Eleanor's search continued for several more days. But as each day passed without a sign of them, she found herself wondering if the cubs had truly left for good. Maybe they had ventured further into the wild, driven by instincts that had long been waiting to awaken. But no matter where they had gone, Eleanor knew one thing for certain. They had survived. They had become the creatures they were always meant to be. And that thought brought her a quiet sense of peace. But then, just as the first snowflakes began to fall, the cubs appeared. It was a late afternoon, the sky painted with shades of pink and purple, when Eleanor heard a soft tap on her door. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be them? When she opened the door, she gasped in disbelief. There, standing in the soft twilight, were the 4 bobcats, tall, graceful, and completely unrecognizable from the tiny cubs she had rescued. Their eyes glowed in the low light, and their powerful forms stood silently, as though they had come to tell her something, to show her that they had not forgotten her, that they had returned. But something was different this time. They were no longer the helpless creatures she had once cradled in her arms. They had transformed into majestic predators, and they had come back to her. As the days grew colder and the first signs of winter began to blanket the forest, the bobcat's return took on an unexpected and deeply moving significance. Eleanor stood at her door, her eyes wide with disbelief, as she took in the sight of the 4 adult bobcats standing just outside her cabin. They had changed, grown stronger, and the wildness that had always been within them was now fully apparent. Their sleek bodies, marked with the characteristic dappled patterns of the bobcat, looked regal and powerful against the snow-covered backdrop of the forest. It was no longer the vulnerable, fragile creatures she had rescued, but fully grown predators in their prime. For a long moment, Eleanor stood frozen, unsure of what to do. She had never expected them to return, especially after so much time had passed. It was clear that the bond they once shared was not one that could simply be broken. The cubs had grown into magnificent creatures, but there was something more in the way they stood there, something that felt like a deep, unspoken connection, a recognition of the love and care she had shown them when they were at their most helpless. But the surprise didn't end there. As Eleanor looked closer, she noticed something even more astonishing. Nestled among the bobcats were two small figures, their fur soft and new. They were tiny cubs, barely able to stand on their own, their large eyes wide with curiosity as they huddled close to the older bobcats. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. The adult bobcats had not just returned to her. They had brought their own young with them. It was an overwhelming moment for Eleanor. The bobcats had come back, not just to seek warmth and safety, but to share something deeper, perhaps to show her how they had thrived, how they had continued the cycle of life in the wild, just as she had taught them all those years ago. These were not just wild creatures, but her cubs, the ones she had saved, the ones she had nurtured and taught to survive. And now, they had returned with their own offspring, as though offering a gift, an acknowledgement of her role in their survival, and a gesture of gratitude that spoke volumes. The adult bobcats moved with the confidence and grace that only the wild could cultivate, but their eyes, those same eyes that had once been so vulnerable and trusting, now held a depth of wisdom. It was clear that they remembered her, that the bond between them was something that transcended the simple act of rescue. They had come back not out of necessity, but out of love, respect, and perhaps a deep instinctive knowledge of the care she had given them when they were nothing more than helpless little creatures. For days, the bobcats stayed close to the cabin. They didn't enter, but they hovered near the door, watching Eleanor with quiet, knowing eyes. They would leave small offerings for her, rabbits, birds, even a small deer once, laying them carefully by the cabin as if to show their appreciation. The gifts, though silent, spoke volumes. It was their way of giving back, of showing her that they had not forgotten her kindness, that they had not forgotten the care she had shown when they had no one else. Eleanor watched them, humbled by the gesture. She had raised them with the understanding that one day they would return to the wild, that they would take their place in the forest and live the lives they were meant to live. But she hadn't expected them to return in this way, bringing their own cubs, ensuring that the cycle of life would continue, that the bond between them would not be lost. The days passed, and as the snow began to fall heavier, the bobcats would occasionally sit in the distance watching over Eleanor. She didn't need to see them every day to know they were there. It was as though they were keeping a silent vigil over her, just as she had done for them when they were in need. The cubs they had brought, so small and innocent, would play near the forest's edge, their tiny, inexperienced paws stumbling as they tried to mimic the movements of their elders. Eleanor had no way of knowing how long they would stay. Perhaps they were simply paying homage to the place that had been their sanctuary, or perhaps they were offering something deeper, an acknowledgement of the woman who had given them life when they were so close to losing it. Whatever the reason, it became clear to Eleanor that these wild creatures had returned the favor, not just by surviving, but by sharing a piece of their world with her. They had given her a gift more profound than she could have ever expected. The quiet moments with the Bobcats were a reminder of the delicate balance between nature and the creatures it nurtures. Eleanor had given them a chance, and in return, the wild had come back to her, not just as a symbol of the creatures she had saved, but as a testament to the bond that could exist between human and animal. And as the first heavy snow of winter fell, Eleanor knew that she had witnessed something extraordinary, a full circle of life, of love, and of wild, unspoken gratitude. As winter settled deeper into the forest, Eleanor found herself in a place of quiet reflection. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in a soft, unbroken layer of white. The cold was biting, but there was warmth in her heart as she sat by the fire, her gaze often drifting toward the door, where the Bobcats and their cubs would occasionally appear, their figures outlined in the pale light of the setting sun. It had been a strange and unexpected turn of events, one that she had never imagined. The cubs, now fully grown and thriving in the wild, had returned, not just to seek shelter, but to offer something she hadn't expected, their gratitude. Each day the Bobcats would bring food to her cabin. It wasn't an ordinary offering, not like the typical gifts one might expect. The animals they brought were always carefully chosen. Rabbits with thick fur, a deer caught with a precision that only wild hunters could master, or sometimes even the remains of larger game, left in the snow with a kind of reverence. Eleanor understood the significance of these gifts. They were not just acts of survival, they were acts of appreciation. The Bobcats had learned to hunt for themselves, and yet they brought her these offerings as a way of honoring the care she had shown them when they were helpless, tiny cubs in need of rescue. The sight of them, those regal, silent creatures who had once been so small and fragile, was a reminder of the incredible transformation they had undergone. They had survived, they had thrived, and now they had their own cubs to care for. The cycle of life was continuing before her eyes. Every time they came, with their sleek fur and powerful bodies, Eleanor felt both a sense of awe and sadness. They no longer needed her in the way they once did, but their presence was a sign that they had never truly forgotten her. Though they had become wild again, there was a tenderness in the way they approached her. They didn't seek to stay inside the cabin as they had in the past, but they would sit outside, just beyond the threshold, watching her with those keen, intelligent eyes. Sometimes they would nudge the door open just enough to leave their gifts, always making sure she could see them clearly before walking away. It was as though they were offering a part of themselves, a piece of the wild that they had come to embody, as a thank you for the care she had given them all those years ago. But it wasn't just the gifts they brought that made her heart swell with pride. It was the way they had become symbols of something deeper, of survival, of the delicate bond between human and nature, and the powerful circle of life. The cubs they had brought with them were a living testament to that bond. These tiny creatures, so innocent and new, were the continuation of a legacy Eleanor had helped create. She had been the one to raise them, to show them the ways of survival, and now she was witnessing the next generation. The new cubs, just like their parents, had a wildness about them, an energy that was untamed, pure, and free. As the snow fell heavier each evening, Eleanor would often sit at the window, watching the bobcats and their young play near the tree-line. They would pounce on imaginary prey, their small bodies darting through the snow, learning the ways of the world around them. The older bobcats, meanwhile, would stand guard, always alert, always aware of their surroundings. It was a beautiful sight, one that filled Eleanor's heart with both joy and sorrow. The cubs had grown up, and though they still remembered her, they were no longer hers to care for. Their journey had taken them far from the shelter of her cabin, and they had become the true kings and queens of the forest. One evening, after the last of the snow had fallen, the bobcats came for one final visit. It was the quietest visit yet, and Eleanor could tell that it was their way of saying goodbye. They brought no gifts this time, no food to lay at her feet. Instead, they stood together in front of the cabin, watching her silently as the night settled in. Their eyes held something deeper now, an understanding that had been there all along, but now, more than ever, was clear. It was a silent farewell, a recognition that they had come full circle. She had given them the gift of life when they needed it most, and now they had returned to give her the gift of their gratitude. As the bobcats turned and disappeared into the trees, Eleanor felt a deep sense of peace. She knew that they had found their place in the wild, that they had fulfilled the purpose she had hoped for them. The cycle of life had been completed, and it was time for her to let them go. But even as they vanished into the forest, she knew that the bond they shared would never truly fade. The memory of their return, of the trust and gratitude they had shown her, would remain in her heart forever, a reminder of the incredible, wild gift she had been a part of. The forest, with all its secrets and stories, had come full circle, and Eleanor's life was richer for it.